personally been able to do other writings and projects with creators online. I like to focus on the idea of mental health and neurodiversity in my writing. But yeah, that's a brief summary of what I do.
You were saying, sorry. I put it back now.
Okay, so my name is Thomas R. Wilson. I have published several books. I have worked on several online articles revolving around mental health and neurodiversity. I have also worked with several creators. A lot of my writing does focus on the neurodiverse and mental health communities, inspired by my own life, but I have also worked very hard to create other writings as well through resource libraries and other formats in order to best help the community.
That's brilliant, and thank you for sharing. And in your perspective of being an author, what is the world of authorship like now to years ago?
I think one of the key differences is putting the power of keeping the written word in the hands of creators. I think there is a beautiful power in self-publishing because I think for a long time, a lot of publishers have wanted to contain writing within their world. And now I think with the emergence of self-publishing and many creators wanting to own more of their work and do more for themselves, it's really opened up this idea that you don't have to be in the 1% of, authors, publishers accept, as well as also the idea that creators are exploring and revolutionizing a format that really allows them to keep all of who they are and their work closely without having to put too much pressure on themselves to conform to a pattern that really doesn't work for a lot of people.
Interesting. And when you talk about format, and I know that different authors have different writing processes. So what's your writing process when it comes to curating a book, and also that kind of process of from an idea to mid-stage to then publish stage?
So a lot of it for me, I typically write a book. I want to start with what I really want to write about. So I've done poetry and other styles of writing, and it typically happens when I feel that I need to be truly inspired. So I always start with what inspires me and what my mission for the book is. Following that up, I try to narrow down how, as someone who writes about mental health and neurodiversity in my own writings, I try to really narrow down what it is I'm trying to discuss and the importance of that. And then as someone who self-published before also, I look for high quality creators who can do book covers, who can do formatting. I'm personally not super great at formatting my own work. And also the other aspect is looking for an editor, someone who can read through my work, keep it within the realm of what I need it to be, but offer an objective voice that is somewhat critical and allows me to shape that. After that, as I'm writing, I really try to narrow down who I am trying to reach in my writing, who I want to be able to read it. And then after that, it is a process of trying to market to that audience, trying to identify the creatives and the passionate people who want to read it. I've done a lot of marketing at conventions and mental health organizations, which were a big part of my audience for a while. And then I also work really hard throughout that process to make sure I'm caring for myself. I think a lot of putting a book together is a lot of work. So if I'm not making sure to devote me time to myself and not making sure that I'm not honoring my communication with each person in that process, I feel like I'm failing that experience.
Wow, thank you for sharing and that interesting view and outlook. So, in regards to your experience of book launches and kind of conventions, what would you say is the kind of landscape of that, and also your perspective when it comes to conferences or conventions like those events?
So I think it's I might have a unique opinion, but the conventions and the things that I've done to market my books, I find them to be a really valuable resource, depending on where you're going, how you're pitching your book. If you find the right places, people will be receptive. I've spent a lot of my time going to conventions and telling people about my work, but I think the thing to keep in mind is no matter if people are coming to you or you're going to them, it's a sales job. Writing a book is in a lot of ways, trying to market, trying to sales, and both of those elements are really hard. So I had to teach myself at a young age that just because someone says no or they're interested and I don't see anything happen with it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I think a lot of people have the opinion of like sales team or like the marketers of a business being a little smarmy or a little unethical. And I've learned over the years at conventions and things that it's a lot harder to do that work than I think a lot of people want to believe. So I've had to learn how to be a little bit shameless in which I, promote my work. But I've also had to remember that the communities I work with, the people I work with, and I write for are in underserved communities. So the mentality of like trying to market is a complex thing because I don't want to be shameless to a certain degree, but I also have to honor the needs of the community I work with. And so when I'm at conventions, I often find it's quite difficult from time to time to find that balance. But when I do, and I've reached someone, it's a very beautiful connection. I found a lot of people at conventions are eager for my kinds of writing and others, but I find it's a very fine line to walk in life when you're doing that.
Interesting. And in your perspective of the author's world, would you say, because recently we've had this kind of importance of inclusion and that importance of diversity as well, and within your perspective, do you feel that the author's world is diverse and inclusive when it comes to different authors and different outlooks in your personal experience?
So I think it depends on the book and depends on who's writing it. But I would like to say yes. I think for a lot of things, there's always going to be fans that want to gatekeep things and want to keep certain people out. And I've worked really hard to kind of understand that in a lot of fan bases, people who do that don't always view it as a bad thing. And there's two different sides to it. One, a lot of people want to keep out certain minorities and things, but I think in their mind, they're protecting something. They're trying to keep something sacred. And I break it down to the mentality of when you're gatekeeping, you're most likely like thinking of a guard standing outside of a city. And while, cities, you can welcome people in, you can make things inclusive, and you can really expand the world of things. A lot of gatekeepers don't realize that they're not allowing what they're protecting to thrive. And I think for a lot of us, when we are meeting someone who's gatekeeping, it feels like we're being kept out of a community and we're not allowed to go into the metaphorical or the city and allow it to thrive. But the outcome of that, when we don't allow people to be inclusive, we don't continue to reach new communities and bring them into what we're trying to protect, is that the stories or the community, whatever, whichever side of what I've said you want to pick with, is really designed that it won't thrive. The reason I use an idea of a city is because they have to constantly have new people in for the economy to thrive, for things to succeed. And the way I look at that is we have to let people into our fan bases. We have to let people into our stories who are new, who are seeking inclusivity and stories that are kind to other needs and, all these things, because with writing, much like a city, if we don't continue to involve that, we don't continue to let new communities in, things will die. They will starve themselves out. And I think for writers who are trying to include inclusivity, create new stories, new writers, whatever it might be, that is how most things thrive. Making things more accessible is what leads to the pathway of sustainability in writing. And while there are people who don't want that, I don't think they're automatically 100% bad. I think they're trying to protect things, but very long-winded way to say yes, but I hope that all makes sense.
No, it does, and it's quite detailed. And what we can also, I could agree as well, and I'm sure others would agree, it's important to kind of give the context of what is required and also within the element of the author's world and what could be also considered or suggested. That is, I'm sure, mostly important. So carrying on to continue from that, what would be the advice you would give to other authors and upcoming ones, in their beginning journeys of becoming an author?
So there's definitely two things I would say, and I think they go hand in hand. One of them is that no one becomes an overnight sensation. There are authors who write their first book and they're well loved, but I think a lot of people think they want to write something and they want it to be an immediate success. And I think in that mindset, there's a lot of missing details of the amount of work that goes into things, the amount of redefining and thinking through the process of writing a book versus marketing it and being able to reach your community and then handle sales and all of the finite details there. It takes time. And if your first book isn't a success, don't be hard on yourself. There's so many writers who their first few books were not popular. The other thing that I would say is don't write for the sake of becoming rich and famous. I think a lot of people, when they write, they think of Stephen King or Neil deGrasse Tyson or Neil Gaiman, like people who have become staples of their genre, authorities on what they talk about, and they think of them as rich and famous. And I would say for each of those authors, there's millions of people who want to write, potentially thousands who have written, who have dedicated communities who really love what they write, who care about what they write. And I think in the world today, a lot of us want fame. We want success in what we do. But there is so much power in not always making the big time. But I was recently watching Girls 5 Ever on Netflix, and they had a really great quote, which was essentially, it's okay to make it to the middle time. You can work, you can do what you love, you can have what you want in life and not always make it to the big time. And I think the beauty of that is that a lot of people forget about that and forget that they can reach a solid community without making millions of dollars and still be happy and still care about what you want to do in life.
Yeah, thank you for that share and that interesting insight. So, what would be the best tip to keep authenticity within trending times of modern technology?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say, I would definitely say, when it comes to being authentic, when it comes to technology changing, I think there's one thing that technology will never have, and that human beings have intrinsically within us, which is humanity in our art. I mean, I see all this AI stuff that comes up, and it writes some really cool things, but it doesn't have the artistic beauty that human beings come up with. It doesn't, like, there's all these videos, all these talks, all these things about AI taking over. And I think in writing and in many forms of art, and even just construction, which in its own way is art in and of itself, there is technology can't absorb that. It can't do it right. And so what I would say is write, create, inspire what really matters to you, what you know you love and what you have a passion for, and light the fire of that passion. Because chances are no one's going to have exactly what you can do. No one's going to be able to write the poetry, tell the story the way that you can, and technology is not going to do it. I think one of the great things about human beings is we are adaptable, we are creative, we are inspiring, and technology can catch up to us, but if we continue to work hard on what makes humans unique, I don't think technology will ever really catch up to that fully.
Interesting. And would you say within the libraries and within the importance of bookstores, what's been your experience within your local area of this? Would you say that they're needing more support, or what's the kind of changing demographics from your perspective?
So I think there's something really neat about my local area, which is there's a lot of smaller shops in my area. And I think the great thing about the little bookstores we have is they are valuable parts of the community. I know a lot of people are talking that bookstores are going to die out and things, but I think when you have an established place that you are comfortable in, that has a charm, and when you walk in, you feel that joy of being there. I think that, you know, at least in my community, it's something very unique. It's something very special that you don't find in a lot of the world anymore. So I think for a lot of communities, those tiny bookstores may get fewer and fewer, but there's always going to be that special connection to them. And while the world changes and things develop, I think human beings are going to want that. We're going to want that experience. So as shopkeepers develop their own stores and their own ideas, I think the most important changing of the world around us is that there are always going to be those shops that they may adapt, but they're going to have the heart of the community in them. And even as the world builds around them, I think those shops are going to stick around, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting insight, and I would say it does. And within the kind of element of what made you become an author, if you can give a bit of detail of your backstory and what kind of inspired you to become an author, that'd be really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have loved stories ever since I was really little. Younger than I can remember loving stories. I always say that I was born from stories because stories have been such an important part of my life as a kid. I remember being a 4-year-old hearing Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven for the first time and absolutely adoring it. I think it was 5 years old was the first time I was like, I'm going to be a writer. That's what I'm going to do. And in my life, I've spent a lot of my life living with, mental health issues, with neurodiversity, with so many different diagnoses. And I found that writing, when it's done well, is one of the most beautiful expression of what it is to be a human, how we struggle, how we cope, how we develop our ideas. And so at a young age, I realized that, and it's something that I've wanted to be and something that I'll continue to want to be in my adult life. I've also spent a lot of time listening to storytellers, and reading Rainbow was a big part of my life as a kid, and storytelling conventions were a big part of my life. So I like to say that I've always had the element of storytelling in my life. It's always been a huge part of me. But I think with the writing I do, one of the central things that made me want to write is acknowledging that I have a capacity to write and speak in a way that a lot of people in my community don't. And I have a willingness to share a story that is very similar to a lot of people, but very different. But also, I do it in a way in which people enjoy. So, a big part of why I write is to spread awareness, education, and further power into my community so people do not feel so alone, so they don't feel so afraid, and so they can read something that allows them to be heard, even if they're not going to share their story.
Thank you for giving us that insight. And in your perspective of mental health and authors, what do you feel the situation is like currently? Would you say that authors, even though they're able to have that outlet of putting their words, their thoughts into words and that creative ability, do you think that is enough? Or do you think that, there is kind of an issue with a crisis when it comes to mental health and authors?
So I am a big believer that many authors struggle with mental health needs. There's a lot of ties to neurodiversity in writers and mental health needs and writers. And I think there's a lot that I could touch on, from the reality of, self-care for authors and how they write and how stories are developed and so many different things. But a couple things I'll touch on. I think many writers, they channel into their writing and they forget to care for themselves. There's so many stories of Stephen King and his addiction struggle, and many other writers who have really struggled. And I would always advise to really care for yourself, especially if you're writing something that is deeply personal. The other thing with writers in the mental health community that I would always say is massively important is the understanding that intentionality is so key when you're writing about mental health. Many people forget about how poorly the mental health and neurodiverse and other communities have been represented in writing and in media in general. It's awful. And just the amount of times that I've seen something tragic happen and the news jumps to, is this person mentally ill? There are some really problems within how people write. And I would always advise, be intentional and be accurate in how you write about mental health, because you're not just sharing the story with yourself or close friends, you're sharing it with the world. And a lot of the world likes to still believe that stigma is appropriate, that people with mental health are labeled into 2 to 3 categories. And I think we as people also need to educate people in general about how to write mental health better. And I think as writing evolves, because it's not going to go away, we need to be appropriate in, as writers for ourselves, how we care for ourselves as we're telling our stories, but what and how we're willing to share our stories with the world. I think there's a lot of recoil that can happen after having a successful book. And then people catch on to it and they miss the point, or that author becomes a success and they have to now deal with the world knowing some of their deeper secrets, which is always going to be hard for anyone. And I think just mindfulness, intentionality, and self-care are going to be the building blocks of this community as writers, I believe.
Thank you for sharing. And would you say that the kind of value of... Okay, so when we talk about the writing process and when we talk about authorship, would you say there's that kind of, because, okay, for me, for example, I was a person that you probably would say that wasn't really able to read and learn to read quite later in my life. So what would you say would be the kind of practicing blocks for individuals to kind of be able to read and kind of have those skills? Because I know that this is a challenge when it comes to particular individuals. What was your first way of learning to read?
So, I mean, for me, my first introduction to learning to read was other people reading stories to me. It was a big motivator for me wanting to read. And I think, so one of the things I definitely know is true of a lot of people with neurodiversity and other needs that are more complex is, well, I should say not more complex, but complex in different ways, is that school systems and reading programs and other things are designed for very particular kinds of students. And they're not always taught well. And I was lucky enough that I had teachers at the time who were really helping me to cultivate my passion in writing. But as I continued to develop my needs further and further into school years, I found a lot of teachers really shut down the opinion that I was going to read well, that I was going to be a success. And my exposure was the only thing that really kept me reading was my love for the written word. Otherwise, school would have failed me and I would have given up reading and writing. However, I know a lot of people who've had that fallout of reading is not enjoyable to them because schools ruined it or teachers ruined it. And I think there's a lot of faults within the school systems around the world because a lot of students are taught to read and write how the teachers want them to learn to read and write. Like, they don't teach people how they actually learn, which is a big part of one of my main jobs is helping advocate on different forms of education. But I would say for people in general outside of me, other than my passion, I would always advise seek that person's passion out and why they want to read and write. Teach them how they learn, not how you want them to learn. And help them cultivate an understanding, whatever age they are learning to read, that there should not be, and there is not, a shame around reading and writing. I think a lot of people stop reading and writing because they feel guilty or they feel ashamed. And I don't think that should be the case. We should really encourage and foster the idea that all people learn to read and write at their level, at any skill level, at the capacity that they are able to. And really, I could go on a whole tangent about this, but really the focus I give is make sure you are cultivating that passion, make sure you're honoring the individual, and really make sure that you are treating them with the respect and the dignity so that they will want to continue to read and write.
Thank you for that detailed share and that kind of important highlight on that topic and question. So it's much appreciated. In regards to inspirations or people who were key authors that kind of were influential in your life, who would these be and why, if I may ask?
So just to double check, you're asking who inspired me to read and write? Okay.
Yes.
So I would definitely say Edgar Allan Poe was a big part of that. I've loved his writing ever since I was really young. I've also had a lifelong love of Dr. Seuss and Winnie the Pooh and Paddington. Although I think probably the biggest influence when it comes to reading and writing, there was a storyteller whose stage name or real name, I'm not sure, It goes by Odds Botkins. I went to a storytelling festival when I was really young, maybe 5 or 6. And I got to listen to Odds Botkins tell a story of the Iliad. And to this day, it's one of the most profound examples of expert storytelling that I've ever heard. And that was a big drive for me to become a storyteller. And when I look back on the world of storytelling, that moment is one of the defining points, in my honest opinion.
Thank you for sharing. And in regards to your perspective on the kind of future of reading and kind of writing, and also the world of authorship, what do you think it may look like 20 years from now, or what exciting things are happening in that world currently?
So I think 20 years from now, writing and reading is probably going to look very different. One of the things I love about the technological boom we have had is that reading tablets have increased. Speaking tablets, access for people who are vision impaired or have other cognitive issues where reading is hard. There's Audible, which I absolutely love. There's so many different resources out there that have made reading and stories more accessible than ever, let alone just communication in general. And I think in 20 years, we're going to continue to see more of that. We're going to see the evolution of the idea of what reading and writing and authorship really is. I would personally love to see the idea of more creators moving to audiobooks, becoming more of a thing. But I think in that there's going to be a lot of push and a lot of fight back from communities. But I think ultimately, with all of these things, despite all the grumbling, despite all the frustration, I think there's going to be more and more people who see the value in alternative reading, in alternative publication, and especially self-publication. And I think we're going to have more authors in the world than we've ever had, because the idea and the exploration of what it is to read, write, and be an author is going to grow. Now, that's a bit idealistic, but I find when it comes to something like this, in these moments, it's best to do that because it helps set an expectation and a hope for the community listening.
Really interesting. And would you say, because I asked all my guests this question, do you believe in world peace? And what's your outlook on the word world peace?
I love that question. I do believe in world peace. I think it's something that we can achieve. I don't know if it's necessarily ever going to be the idea of all people getting along and we're always happy and we're always smiling and people are going to sing songs in the street, or there's going to be no conflict in the world. I think world peace really, in my mindset, is more the idea of acceptance, more the idea of group togetherness. I don't think there's ever going to be a point in human history where families won't argue, where governments aren't going to be mad at each other. But I think there's going to be a point, a turning point at some point, where people are going to recognize that violence, greed, and hostility don't make sense. Like I said, never going to be completely gone. But I think there's going to be a point where we're really going to start examining what's holding us back and moving it. Again, a bit idealistic, but it's something I believe.
Okay, and in regard to your projects or things that you would like to share, what are any projects or things that you would like to share with the community that they could be aware of?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on putting together my own storytelling camp in my home state of Colorado. I'm currently working with a couple different writers on the powers of shared storytelling, on how it can help and impact the neurodiverse community and support them. So I recommend keeping an eye on those. And I have several others that I'm sure I don't have time to mention, but I can make sure to pass along my link sheet. And then the other thing I'd like to say is if anyone wants to learn more or have discussions, I like to think of those as projects. Please let me know, because questions need to be asked more in the world, as they are the pathway to power. So if you have questions or there's something you would like me to work on, please feel free to reach out to me. I really appreciate anyone who is willing to ask questions.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I would like to say thank you for your time, Thomas. And thank you to everyone who's been watching. Do stay tuned for any of our updated interviews in the coming weeks or days. And yes, if there's any last remarks that you would like to share, Thomas.
I would say, the last thing I would like to say is there's nothing wrong with being a dreamer. There's nothing wrong with being a bit idealistic. And I would say if you have something you want to do in life, if there's something you want to achieve, truly the only thing that is really holding you back the most is your unwillingness to do it or your fear in doing it. Not everything should be done in the world, like violence and things like that, but I find dreams are beautiful. They're the child of inspiration and passion. So if you've heard my story, just know I am constantly being willing to try new things and chase after my dreams. And I would highly recommend you do the same. The world needs more dreamers.
That's lovely. And thank you for sharing. And thank